Welcome, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Shelley Carey, and I am a Research Director here at PBMI. I'd like to mention a few things before we get started. Today's webinar is being recorded. A link to the recording will be sent later today. You can find a copy of today's presentation in the handout section of your control panel. Simply click on the file to download it. You will have the opportunity to submit questions to today's presenter by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We will address them during the Q&A session at the end. I will now turn the floor over to Jane Lutz.
Great, thank you, Shelley. Good morning or good afternoon to all of you, wherever you are in the country. My name is Jane Lutz, and I serve as the Executive Director here at the Pharmacy Benefit Management Institute, or PBMI. Welcome, and thank you all so much for joining us today. It's great to have such a large group of people with us today for our webinar, Headaches No More, Improving Parity and Medical Specialty Reimbursement. So during our webinar today, we're going to showcase a case study that is being presented by Dr. Craig Stern, who is the president of Pharma Pharmaceutical Consultants, which is based in California. In his presentation, Dr. Stern will showcase how a large public health plan in California identified issues in the payment of specialty pharmacy claims paid under the medical benefit. An innovative approach was necessary to correct these claims adjudication issues. So before we get started, let me tell you a little bit more about our speaker today. Dr. Craig Stern is the president of Pharma Pharmaceutical Consultants and a frequent speaker at PBMI and other industry events. Dr. Stern formed Pharma Pharmaceutical Consultants as independent consultants to multi-hospital corporations, payers, and providers with special emphasis in managed care. The practice focuses on the design and management of pharmacy benefits, integration of pharmacy and medical benefits, data analysis, auditing, strategic analysis and planning and implementation, and the management of pharmacy risk for provider groups. In addition to this big role at Pharma, Dr. Stern is also very busy as a professor of pharmacy at the University of Southern California, the University of California at San Francisco, the University of the Pacific, and the Western University of Health Science. So at this time, I'd like to turn the presentation over to Dr. Craig Stern. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Good morning or good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted to have a chance to talk to you. We are going to talk about medical specialty and medical specialty reimbursement. Dr. Chris Chan from Inland Empire was not able to join us for this as he did when we did the presentation at the last PBMI meeting. So I'm going to take over all the responsibility for it. I do and probably want to address the fact of how this even started, and that was Chris called me and asked that he had some problems with regard to the information technology department and how should he handle it. And he was aware, as am I, that the issue of medical specialty is not unique. It's not something that's only happening with regard to drugs under the specialty pharmacy benefit, and that we needed something where we could deal with it internally and develop an internal program that had elements of what he wanted as well as what we would do, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But it's important to realize that these tools and skills that we're about to talk about have been used, are being used in multiple locales, and so the notion that things are not happening in medical specialty is in fact incorrect. Having said that, let me kind of launch into this to try and deal with what we want to address. The initial rationale that Chris had talked to me about was problems with regard to inappropriate claims adjudication. And since the plan, we had to deal with multiple different departments, it was important that first we address the transactional issues with regard to that. There was also a lack currently within the institution of PBM-like edits that we needed to institute, as well as that there had to be now and in the future issues with regard to FWA or fraud, waste, and abuse oversight. There was more than just point of sale or location of service type of look, but had to be a multi-point kind of issue. As a result of that, we wanted also to deal in the future being several months rather than years, in dealing with issues in site of care and medical formulary with regard to medical rebates, auto adjudication rules, and hybrid benefit coordination. So we were dealing with something that was going to be internal, had to deal with multiple different departments, had to deal with normative pricing, as well as to deal with things that were entirely transparent so that the plan had a very clear understanding of what costs were, what cost reduction issues were, et cetera. The current setup was a bit disjointed in that pharmacy services dealt with conducting a prior authorization and claim review. They identified during that there were adjudication issues, there were contract problems where we weren't paying a contract, there was clearly problems with regard to miscellaneous coding, and so as a result of that, it was necessary as step one to deal with transaction and try and solve those problems and then move to the others. It was also important that once pharmacy prior authorization review was going on, to coordinate it with medical utilization management so that it could be completed. So once again, it was a multi-department kind of issue. Our challenges that we had from the beginning was there was a different time for turnaround with requirements compared to utilization management, namely clearly with medical there is lag, and so it was necessary to deal with lag versus what was going on in pharmacy at the time with regard to immediate service at the point of distribution. There was also issues with regard to split review decisions where pharmacy had one opinion, medical had another, and we needed to address that as a challenge. There was clearly system capabilities, and later, while we were doing this, the medical claim adjudication system was changing, so we had to address first the problems with the old system and then problems with the new system. The claim system was hard to navigate. It was often invisible, which meant that we had a problem with auto adjudication rules that we needed to establish so that claims could be paid appropriately. Clearly, there were issues with regard to medical documentation, and we needed to upgrade and deal with CPT codes and drug codes because the plan clearly has a risk not just for drugs but also for the complete cost of care, and so it's necessary to make sure that we had aligned those. And then how do we make appropriate decisions and deal with utilization reporting and dealing with that with physicians. So there was multiple challenges about what we do. Having said that, let me talk about what we did do, and that was first to deal with a review of the current status, try and deal with this uncoordinated benefit management between specialty and medical, of which clearly the first step was to deal with medical to get that cleaned up, and then to deal with a very highly competitive medical environment, which was not unique to Inland Empire, meaning there's a very competitive environment on the medical side between areas such as doctor's office and urgent care centers and emergency room and hospital and other areas, all of them highly competitive, highly different bases of costs that are being used, and clearly important issues about how we address it versus some of the things that we were currently seeing under pharmacy, where there was perhaps one or two actual locations of service to address. So it was a bit more competitive and complex in dealing with the medical environment. We did have to deal with transactional issues, which I'll talk about in a moment. And then as an offspring of that, also to deal with the clinical effectiveness tests so that we were dealing with sites of care, et cetera, where the argument wasn't just that it was a pharmacy versus a medical, but rather how do we deal with appropriate sites of care within the medical benefit or any other, since we're dealing with the total cost of the treatment. We will show outcomes and show what happened, and then, as I've indicated, relatively quickly, but not, we want to deal with the first priorities first, and that was to deal with cost reduction, building an appropriate medical formulary, working on medical benefit rebates in an entirely transparent model, data expansion so that we're starting with drug issues and trying to solve those. And frequently IT couldn't tell the difference between a drug claim and a non-drug claim, but to deal with then data expansion to deal with all of the other CPT-related issues and procedures and radiology and laboratory, et cetera, to deal with that. And then, of course, utilization management, how we're going to actually change the system, moving to academic detailing and profiling and peer-to-peer reporting, making that entirely digital so that we've cut down significantly on the amount of work that anyone has to do. This obviously is scalable so that we could start with it in a very small area, and perhaps others that are out there can deal with it in small kind of institutions, but then of course scalable so it could be dealt with across the spectrum in what we did. And then of course trending, because you want to make sure that whatever you've done has in fact made an impact in what it is. And then, of course, bring in FWA or fraud, waste, and abuse, dealing with it from a multi-point probability issue so that it's not just at point of care, but rather what's going on at multiple points so that we can target those, deal with as Medicare and Medicaid have pushed for us in order to deal for prevention over identification so we can address that. I'm also showing the report selection criteria that we have to give a selection of that because we are dealing with multiple different departments. So it's important that we could filter, they could filter in any fashion so that they had information that was applicable to pharmacy, those that were applicable to medical and utilization management, those that were applicable to IT, those that were applicable to the CFO, et cetera. In a graphical way, all of this is digital and is web-based and also set up so that it's not version control because there were some issues with regard to which versions of Excel or other kind of reporting were up to date in any given system. So it is there in a basic web-based system and others, but just to give some graphical idea, transaction issues were the first thing that we were going to attack, and I'll show what happened with regard to each one, drilling down all the way to the individual claim so that we could see it, we could show it to IT, we could make it clear what had to happen, and then we would use that as a basis for auto adjudication, and then what was the impact of that. Following on that was to deal with clinical effectiveness and clinical effectiveness testing, to deal with effectiveness tests with regard to companion genomic testing, an antibiotic chip, a ambulatory testing with regard to drug interactions and adverse effects and drug-induced disease, adherence, etc., many of which are coded in the claim as the first step and then second steps in dealing with what we would do, and then obviously moving it to trending because everything that we're doing was predicated to have we made an impact, what is the problem, where do we have to shift our information in order to deal with further emphasis on a particular problem. The change agent of this, of course, goes under the broad definition of academic detailing, but in its specifics has to deal with medical specialty, physician profiling, trying to identify individuals who are best in class or centers of excellence in what's going on, and then to, once again, look for billing trends and drug selection, and finally to fraud, waste, and abuse. All of this is digital. I'm going to show it on slides as was requested in order to deal with this. But be aware that this was integrated so that people could jump around and pick what they wanted, or individual departments could get to what they wanted to address this. Once again, this was scalable so that it was important that any given benefit or any given area could work on it, but it was scalable so that it could be dealt with across the entire spectrum of what went on. What did we do about the transactional gaps, which was step one? First, we had to do a historical review, so we quickly got a year and a half worth of data in order to review what was going on, find out what the transactional issue problems were, deal with whatever trending was actually going on, certainly filtering where there were issues with regard to Fqhc or federally qualified healthcare centers or others for which there might be different bases of cost in 340B or otherwise. And then, of course, bases of cost by location of service, where we took all of the different benefits, all of the different prices of cost, et cetera, in order to deal with it. And right now there's about a dozen of them, so that's being tested against in order to deal with it. From this, the goal would be to prioritize those filters, identify those that have the largest gaps, implement cost reduction and total cost. I'm going to show drug cost here, but there's a whole other group going on, a whole other reporting analysis going on in total cost that would be perhaps too big for some of these slides. And then quality and utilization management, where we're identifying and diagnosing and targeting offenders of quality problems, profiling the targets and offenders, and then trending what goes on. I'll give you some quick examples of what is being seen out of the initial analysis, and that is that we identified that there was a significant amount of claims that were for unmatched diagnosis, where the drug was not matched with the specific ICD-10 or earlier ICD-9 codes in order to deal with what the approved diagnosis was, so that we could identify that to IT, include that in what was going on with our adjudication rules. We certainly had issues with regard to miscellaneous codes like 3490s, 3590s, 9999s, where they were unclassified, and we needed to identify that to IT department. There was some reluctance at the beginning because of problems where they didn't think that there was a need for it. Certainly their medical systems didn't necessarily always include it, or they included it in a text field, but we gave them information from Medicare and Medicaid identifying the necessity of it, and effectively changed those opinions to what was going on. We also had to deal with term codes, whether they were J codes termed or whether they were issues with regard to NDC codes that were termed or anything else that was termed, so that we could identify that, include that in our adjudication rules so that those could be fixed. Now, one of the goals was to deal with normative pricing. And one of the offshoots of that was that in our payments, we weren't always paying what the contracted rate was. And so having loaded all of the contracting rates, et cetera, and dealing with it when we were dealing with our initial analysis, we were able to identify where we weren't paying claims according to what the actual contract rates were and what had to be changed. This was also a major issue with regard to IT in trying to correct some of the adjudication rules. There was also an issue where we were paying more than what was billed. Part of this had to do with miscellaneous coding that was being corrected, and some of it didn't have to do with miscellaneous coding. It was just where paid amounts and billed amounts were not consistent. And just as a side issue, every physician was profiled with regard to the billed versus paid, so they became also a target for us to address with regard to utilization. It was important because in many cases, some physicians had a lot of miscellaneous coding or coding for which they were trying to address certain billing arguments that were greater than what should have been the contracted amount paid, either through coding that they were using or other type of methodologies. And we wanted to make sure that this was being corrected or fixed, whether it was a small part of the organization or scaled to a large part of the organization. We wanted to make sure that that was fixed. Were there duplicate payments? When we looked in our first initial, we didn't identify anything. We did identify that there needed a correction of coding gaps. So first we needed to deal with the miscellaneous and non-NDC codes that were being submitted, some of which were not drugs. They were dealing with it with devices or supplies or IV pumps and poles or whatever in order to deal with it. And once that is done, then we can address those coding gaps within the same therapeutic categories as well as duplicates. We often see duplicate therapies in the same therapeutic class, but until we had corrected the miscellaneous coding, we couldn't address those, and so we're handling that now. And this is very common in the medical and pharmacy specialty when you're dealing with integrated data sets and one sees duplicate payments. In this regard, one of our goals, not the initial step one, but the goals was to deal with correcting what was going on in medical and then dealing with an integrated data set to fix it. As a result of that, we wanted to deal with our normative pricing so that we could, in fact, ensure that there was complete transparency in what we were paying. Clearly, it also had an impact on what our contracts were with physicians and in some cases, some pharmacy groups, et cetera. So we have lowest price comparators of what we're doing and dealt with it both from a institutional standpoint as well as from what was going on in individual membership, doctors, et cetera. There was a wastage that was going on because there were rules with regard to multi-source and single-dose dosage forms. It had been where the pharmacy staff was doing back-of-the-envelope kind of calculations. This was automated so that all of the wastage calculations was being done to take that process away from them, and effectively then they had a more standard approach to what was going on with calculating of wastage, dealing with compliance with multi-dose vials and things like that in order to deal with appropriate payment. There was also issues with regard to maximum quantities. This is not uncommon. Clearly, quantity is one of the biggest problems in the medical claim issue. We also see it on the pharmacy issue, but it's a big issue on the medical claim issue, mostly because the utilizers either are unaware of CMS 1500 requirements or they are doing it because they don't know what they're supposed to be doing in units. So this became a corrective issue that would also be part for IT of what the corrections are. The CFO was heavily involved, as was medical management in trying to clean up the issue in quality and claims. And then, of course, medical management wanted to know whether the dose was right, so that in effect you were doing a prior authorization, pre-cert kind of review, and this was automated so that this was a standard process that had been going on, but for them it was new, so that we could tell them that there were doses that were under or over the maximum allowed of what was happening so that they could target those that had inappropriate dosing and effectively use that either in their prior authorizations or in their criteria in what they did. There was also issues in dosage frequency, so not just the dose, but also the frequency or day supply as we would think about it in the pharmacy. There was also issues there. So all of this testing was going on in order to deal with it. So we've expanded many of the testing beyond what we are currently using in pharmacy to deal with all of these issues that we know based on the diagnosis, based on the frequency, the dosage, the matching with regard to what is happening, and then, of course, coordinating different drugs in, for example, the the cocktails that are given in chemotherapy in order to deal with that. Having said that, while we were dealing with that and working with IT to correct it, we then targeted what were we going to deal with: effectiveness, risk, and clinical management. And so we targeted issues with regard to companion genomic tests, which is oftentimes a major issue with regard to cancer chemotherapy, but also other therapies. We implemented an antibiotic stewardship program, which later is going to be part of a antibiotic selection issue, but it had already been used in other areas and for other uses, and it was incorporated in it so we could try and make sure that antibiotics were used correctly, and then deal with adherence and compliance in what was going on, drug interactions and adverse drug reactions, which are included in the claims to what we do. As an example, our companion diagnostics were part of what you see, where we were looking for the companion diagnosis test and results for that, so that we knew that in fact the particular drugs had the testing that was done, whether it was diagnostically or based on therapeutics in order to manage it. So it became an important part of what we were doing in order to try and correct that. We also, as I've indicated, had established an antibiotic stewardship program, both ambulatory as well as part of what was going on institutionally, so that we had, in this case, we're showing one indication based on the diagnosis in the claims and what was going on, but there's also another 3 or 4 for the ambulatory setting in order to try and ensure the fact that we're using the right drugs in order to deal with infectious problems. Drug interactions occurred, whether it was in IVs or drugs or otherwise, and in what was done. These are all the basis not only for identifying the problem, but also in informing physicians about what needs to be done to correct that, so that they understand what the clinical effects are, what the severity level is of what they have to do, what the management issues are, and then, of course, with appropriate referencing, et cetera, but in order to make this happen. Adverse drug reactions are identified in the claims, so we started there and dealt with what was going on with regard to the drug, what kind of adverse effects were happening, and bring the issue up whether it was entirely applicable or something that the providers needed to know about so that we could address it with appropriate information about what kind of drugs specifically are involved, as well as categories and issues with regard to what the rationale is and what the recommendations are for it. The compliance meant that we were dealing with compliance across the board, but also antibiotic selection compliance with regard to the diagnosis, so that we knew that in this particular case there was 4 potential options, and were any of these drugs compliant with what was going on with multiple options. And that became a major issue, not just with the stewardship program, which is step 1, but also step 2 to deal with, was there compliance with the drug with regard to the diagnosis, and 2, was there a compliance issue with regard to what was going on with the program. So how did it work? How are we doing? From an outcome standpoint, on the left are transactional issues. On the right are some of the clinical tests. This has to deal with trending over time. There's clearly seasonality. The red bars, as you can see, are the highest of what we do. And in a general way, we've done pretty well with a good many of the things, but also allowed us to target where we need more work. For example, we do need to target issues with regard to normative pricing and lowest cost and get that better fixed. Paid versus billed, we think we've done pretty well. Even with seasonality, we've done pretty well with that. And we're doing better with regard to multi-dosing and wastage and things like that. The miscellaneous codes, we do well, and then we do well for a period, and then it pops up again. And so this is a a process. This is a work in progress as we work on this in order to make sure that the groups understand that, and that's true also the miscellaneous coding and NDC coding, et cetera, of what goes on. Obsolete codes we did pretty well with. Our diagnoses, we thought we did pretty well at the beginning for several months, and then it began to come back again. So we're working with the group in both the medical directors, utilization management, and soon with individual out in detailing to the physicians in order to further fix these problems. Frequencies, min-max, et cetera, we think we've done fairly well with, and issues with regard to maximum quantities are still a problem, as well as paid versus contract as we work on this as we begin to move into the rebate sector. On the clinical side, adherence has been a problem, and we continue to review that, and we don't believe that this is going to be changed until there's a greater intervention with the physicians over the data that we have and what they're doing. So we're reviewing this, we're dealing with it both from a medication possession ratio as well as on a PDC over time, so that we can show them in more than one metric what's going on. Our companion genomic testing seems to be relatively flat in that we think we've made some progress on it, and the rest. Drug interactions, we thought we were doing well, and then we've seen some more over time, but we have done well with drug-induced disease. Adverse drug reactions, we seem to be seeing more of that, and that becomes a problem, and the stewardship problem seems to be addressed. The issue to add here is that the plan and departments had the opportunity to set priorities. So they could set priorities about what they thought was important for us to focus on. It's interesting that things like lowest price, paid versus billed, et cetera, were lower for them, mostly because they thought that we could fix these and they could be dealt with mostly with regard to our claim adjudication and soon auto adjudication rules, but other areas where they thought there was going to be a problem, they put a bit greater priority on. So it allowed them ability to customize, but also more than one department to deal with, or if it was only one department in pharmacy, they could pick what they wanted, or physicians could pick some as well. The plan did identify and made some estimates. There is obviously some seasonality, as I've shown you, but we're seeing in what we're doing some potential avoidance issues with regard to cost. This is before we start dealing with the physician interventions in order to deal with utilization, but the potential avoidance issues are not insignificant and have some greater impact about what we're seeing. So what have we done? So far, we attacked the transactional issues and are working on fixing those now and over time. We dealt with our clinical testing, and clearly we need to move to provider management to get greater benefit, but we've already shown you that there is some impact on what happens. And then what do we do in the future? One, with regard to cost reduction, with regard to improving our contracts, our bases of cost, and how we deal with those, as well as how do we deal with medical rebates and decrease the cost. And I'll show you what we're going to do with that, because that's a very transparent issue. It's entirely predicated on contracts with the plan, where the plan and the manufacturer knows what the numbers are, knows exactly what the dollars are. The CFO can use it for budgeting, so there is an involvement from the financial group about this. And so it becomes very much of a highly transparent issue that everybody understands what the elements are and what they can do out of it. And from a clinical management standpoint, where we think that there's potentially equal to or even greater savings than what we have now, is to work on it directly with physicians, and it's all automated, it's on the cloud, so that we can minimize our resource allocation, but at the same time, we can address with them where there are quality gaps and where we expect that there are going to be changes, and then comparing them to their peers, so that individuals who may think that they have a higher severity population, they're being compared to best in class and to others with regard to centers of excellence to do that. This is one example of one of the reporting where we have, this is a real report, sterilized obviously, with regard to the physician and their specialty, locations of service, their diagnoses, what's being spent. Everybody in this has at least a threshold of patients, so we're not comparing somebody with one patient versus somebody with 25. Everybody's in a higher utilization area, and then what they're seeing about it. But in this regard, this is mostly for medical management to deal with for this particular provider. What have they been using? What have their particular costs and quantities been? And then comparing them to a similar provider in what they're doing with regard to similar specialties, similar location of service, similar severity of illness, and then other groups with regard to this as well, so that we've got some comparators here of what's going on in order to try and further refine what best in class is. We've done it also for both pharmacy and medical management, where we know in the top 10s with regard to highest volume, highest severity, locations of service, etc., in what they're using and how they compare with regard to general specialties and subspecialties, so that we can attack these issues, further refining what we're doing in best in class, etc. And another way that we're doing it, just so that it's not kind of a bonehead approach, but rather looking at it in a broader way, is to take a look at it by diagnosis, where we've looked at all of them by diagnosis and asked the question, where are we seeing particular providers who have a significant amount of volume in the lists of them, not just in the list of within the same medical specialty or subcategory specialty, but also dealing with diagnosis. And you can see that we have them in paid and also their cost per utilizer per month, which is a major indicator for us. But also, what is their total impact on the spend in any given diagnosis? And you can see that it in any individual doctor, even if they're best in class, does not have a big percentage of the overall practice until we get to, obviously, some issues with regard to nicotine dependence and smoking, etc. The one area that kind of sticks out is the URIs, or the upper respiratory infections, where there is a certain amount of clustering based on infectious disease and others who are dealing with that. So it isn't just ambulatory that's dealing with all those infections, but some shifting of patients for that. And based on location of service, we're also looking at it to see how it influences what we do with regard to a subset of the claim, so that once again, this is scalable. We can deal with it with part of our departments in dealing with one problem, but we can also scale it up to go with largers. And we looked at this over the entire group of things to see where we're getting a lot of these claims, in this case, obviously, in inpatient hospital and outpatient hospital, but also what we're seeing in the rest of our universe. The following issue, of course, is to deal with cost. And in this regard, the decision was made and the plan was made that all of this is going to be internal, because we needed to make sure that everything is normative pricing, everything is identified as rebatable or not, everything is available for us to be filtering by particular categories, as I indicated earlier, for Fqhc or other groups that may be at 340B pricing and the rest, and we're not trying to target everyone that isn't appropriate, or even those that have a Medicaid or Medicare type of payments that would be a problem for us with regard to that. We have developed over our use a medical formulary and started with that, an identification of who the manufacturers would be, prioritizing our rebate targets, and reporting where the plan it has a contract with the manufacturer. The plan knows exactly what the numbers are. The manufacturer knows exactly what the numbers are. We know everything about what's happening in order to ensure the fact that the plan has an entirely transparent rebate program going on. And then, of course, all of this is predicated on having the data and the transparency, which I'll show you in a moment, and then a reconciliation of medical rebate receipts. This is an example pulling part of it out with regard to some of our current formulary choices. The interest in this is not just to identify the J-codes and the drugs themselves, but in order to deal with a more value-based type of contracting, we have it with the appropriate diagnosis codes and diagnosis descriptions, as well as what we see, how they're being used. So we have an opportunity to see not just a drug-based contract, but a value-based contract in dealing with what goes on and what the costs are. We have some examples of what we've done with regard to manufacturers, particular J-codes that we've chosen. Once again, dealing with the diagnosis, so it's more of an opportunity for value-based. If that becomes part of the issue, that we can compare how much would we be getting on rebates versus how much would we be getting in a value-based program where there are defined clinical targets. And then, of course, just from the data, we know exactly what the claims are and what the NDCs are, and we're correcting that as we go with regard to the transactional issues. What we've done then is we've begun to move transactional management from IT to medical drug claims oversight. So we have started with the claim problem and moved to claim oversight, dealing with what we're going to do with patterns that we've seen in our contracts, issues with regard to what we'll deal with in the in DOFR issues for the financial departments with regard to financial responsibility, what we're dealing with coding and billing issues, and then FWA. And we have then, as a result of that, improvements in coding, provider utilization patterns that we're attacking, and then abuse and waste improvement that we're addressing. So it's not just one point. We're taking what we're doing with regard to the one-point review at point of sale, but also looking at it over time, looking at it historically, what it's been, has it changed as we move on to subsequent months, and attacking that problem in order to deal, once again, with a major emphasis on prevention, most especially with regard to waste and abuse, but then also in a very smaller sense in what's going on with that. And that's a large issue and a separate issue. I didn't have time to add all of the slides and all of that important of what's going on. As a result, as you've seen, we already are dealing with effectiveness with regard to companion genomic testing and our antibiotic stewardship program. We're dealing with risk with regard to adherence, trying to deal with the drug interactions and average drug effects coded in the claims, and then identifying all of the things that we're going to address with the physicians with regard to clinical quality gaps, risk problems to try and reduce that, and then selection of antibiotics, which leaves us finally to our to-do list, and that is to organize and quantify the gaps, try and correct further problems in claim adjudication, because this is a process. It's not that we immediately turn things on and get immediate results. There's multiple departments, multiple issues about what people have, so we need to change behaviors. We're identifying the opportunities for edits in our new core system as we change from one claim adjudication system to another, and then with that, modify and add new claim adjudication rules for the system so that it's entirely automated and we've minimized the amount of resource allocation. Our process is to coordinate the physician-administered drug claims and proper site of care is also part of our auto adjudication, and then also on a follow-up, what we're going to talk to the physicians about. We have enhanced our medical drug financial and utilization reporting. It already exists. It's ready to go. It's on the web and also independent, so that it's available on a desktop, on mobile devices, etc., so that we once again have minimized the amount of manual work. And then we need to now, with our contracting people, go back to deal with contracts, deal with the DOFR issues, clean that issue up, and then do further issue with regard to FWA oversight, where we've already recognized individuals, and we're now working with our security team in dealing with that. And those that don't have it, that are not part of, for example, Inland Empire, we're already dealing with that, where they don't have it. So there's other issues of a way to deal with prevention, et cetera, that we have developed a medical formulary. That, of course, is a constant work in progress. And then, of course, academic detailing that we've referred to about what we do. That's the process. That's what was done. I want to emphasize a couple of things, and that is where this may be a bit different than others, and that is the next steps, of course, are to integrate what goes on in pharmacy and medical. Two is what we have, but I didn't have enough room in the slides to show you where we're dealing with the drug cost versus total cost of care and dealing with that, and that certainly is going to impact what goes on in what I've shown you with regard to centers of excellence and best-in-class comparisons that we'll do on at least a quarterly basis, but probably even more frequently than that. And third is normative pricing, where we're trying to get this pricing down so we know exactly what it is, both contractually in order to change appropriate contracts, at the same time in order to deal with what the pricing is that we're paying in order to deal with because this is California, our Medi-Cal pricing, but also true in other areas with Medicaid pricing or Medicare pricing, and using different bases of cost separate from what goes on in other amounts, whether it's ASO or commercial or whatever. And then clearly developing that into what we do with trying to deal with contraction of cost with regard to our formularies, our rebate programs, et cetera, that are entirely transparent so everybody knows how to handle it. I thank all of you for taking some of your time this morning in order to talk to me. I'll be happy to answer any question that you have. We're not afraid of it, and I wish you all a terrific morning. Jane?
Yes, thank you, Craig. Thanks so much for your perspective and expertise, and certainly thank you for sharing the details of this great case study. I certainly can understand why your client may have had a headache at the beginning of this process, because this is a lot. Hopefully we've given all of you attendees some different ideas and different ways to think when you are approaching the lofty question and challenge of evaluating and managing the cost on the medical side of the specialty drug cost management equation. It's certainly not easy. So at this time, we will open it up to questions. So please, as a reminder, if you have a question, you can type it into the questions section, which is should be on the right-hand side of your monitor in the control panel. So please just go ahead and type your questions in there, and we will get them answered for you. So I do have a couple of questions that have come in, Craig, that I'm ready to ask over for your assistance. The first one is, can this same model be applied to specialty medications covered under the pharmacy benefit and or the an integrated medical and pharmacy benefit?
Yeah, the pharmacy benefit has many of the same elements. Clearly, there are elements that are not in the pharmacy claims at present with regard to diagnosis, certainly issues with regard to claims with regard to other procedures, adverse drug reactions, drug-induced disease, et cetera. But the answer is yes. Part of the plan is to integrate this whole so that both, not just from the medical standpoint as we clean it up, that we can coordinate it with what's going on in pharmacy so we can get these issues with regard to duplicate therapy, diagnostic mismatches that we are seeing, issues with regard to problems in quantities and dosages and all of that can be corrected as well. So the answer is yes. It's also interesting that separate from Inland Empire, it's going on today, and it's going on all the time, where it's being used in different size groups. So it is scalable, and I'd suggest to anybody that these kind of things are available for smaller groups and larger groups, but they also identify the fact that there is a opportunity here where people can use them in more than one setting, because if you're the payer, whether you're a plan or an employer or otherwise, you have a risk for the entire cost of care. So the goal here, of course, is to try and deal with how do you manage that total cost of care, not just drug costs.
Mm-hmm. Here's a question. How does the data result in actual cost savings? Does the plan go back and change reimbursements, or is the plan checking the data before each bill is reimbursed?
Yeah, that's a good question. The first issue is plan savings have to deal with the fact that many of these claims are not replicated, meaning once you clean up the miscellaneous coding, the term coding, etc., there's not a new claim. Historically, across our experience over several years, probably 42 to 44% of all claims are effectively avoided in that regard, and there is an initial cost saving. That's clearly front-loaded. Now, with regard to what happens after, the savings have to deal with, one, the repricing mechanism, which does happen at IT, or if the IT department is not able to handle it, as we saw at the beginning, we effectively repriced and gave them a new price based on what the contract was, what the appropriate basis of cost was, and clearly moving to the normative pricing that we were dealing with in cost. So there was a savings right away at point of sale based on repricing of what was happening. The third issue is one that is an ongoing process, but we think is going to be a much larger cost. It certainly is in other areas, other plans, and that is where you deal with the utilization problem, where there's the wrong drugs being used, the wrong therapy being used, a particular best-in-class where somebody is using a lot of radiology or testing, etc., that goes on that is more than what their peers are doing in what happens. So there's multiple levels, but it's happening right away at point of care, as I've indicated, and then there's also issues where as you clean up the process, you can begin to see the savings savings increased with regard to the other areas in utilization, etc.
Great. Here's a question. Is there any in-EHR messaging involved in helping physicians code or care for patients more efficiently to support better care decisions and outcomes?
That's a great question. I wish there was. There is some, but at the end of the day, physicians are either coding as per some internal coding sheet that they've established, or they're upcoding, or they're doing something else in order to deal with pricing. What is not easily available for physicians today, and that's true also for urgent care centers and some of the other groups that are non-institutional, is that they need to make sure that, one, they understand the CMS 1500 guidelines for quantities, for appropriate kind of diagnoses and pricing. That information is available to a degree, but not common with regard to the provider subset of the market, and issues with regard to cleaning up how they bill for things. Some of the physicians that we've seen have a standard form where people in the back office of their practices and in their group practices can put those coding in order to give them a more standard approach to billing and payment. But the broad answer to your question is no, it doesn't exist, and it doesn't exist across the board. It's not just a medical problem, it's a pharmacy problem. It goes across all billing and the kind of things that they're doing, whether submitting it to a pharmacy, whether they're submitting it to the billing department, whether submitting it to their corporation for billing. there's a problem there, and it's not easily solved at the present time.
Okay, another question. Can specific clinics, Fqhcs, or other variant payment providers be filtered or selected to ensure that normative pricing is not applied?
Yeah. That was a request at the beginning, and the filters already existed. So what you do is you filter out the Fqhcs, you filter out the clinics that are identified for mostly Medicaid or Medi-Cal pricing, Medicare pricing, so that they're not duplicating in payment, they're not duplicating in rebates, they're not duplicating in 340B pricing or whatever they're doing. So yes, that was a request right away. It already existed, and we just filtered those people out, so we didn't have to deal with them.
Mm-hmm. Another question around 340B, and you kind of answered it. I think you mentioned briefly the 340B program. What is the key challenge there for this program?
What is I beg your pardon, what was that?
340B as it relates to these programs. What's the key challenge there for this program?
Yeah. The 340B program presents problems with regard to rebates and the rest. It does not, in general, present problems with regard to drug utilization, with regard to transactional problems, with regard to utilization management problems. So depending on what the emphasis is, what people want, you probably want to look at it with regard to the transaction problems in order to address those and get those fixed. You want to deal with where they're not using, obviously, term codes and miscellaneous codes as well as the appropriate coding, the diagnosis is matching, etc. And you certainly want to deal with them with regard to utilization and clinical problems where there's adherence problems or issues with regard to drug interactions, etc. When it comes time to how do you pay the claim and how do you deal with it from a rebate standpoint, then that is a concern. And so in that regard, you either accept that you're going to be checking it from a transaction, you accept that you're going to be checking it from clinical, and you turn off what you're dealing with regard to payment and rebate, or you include them under a 340B, or you separate them out so that they're addressed with totally separately for how they do. So it's discretionary, and you can kind of pick what you want. In this particular regard, because we had issues transactionally, our problems were to remove them right away so that we didn't have to deal with their problems. But I suspect that going forward, we're going to have to address the issues with regard to how are they being paid, how are they being addressed, stuff like that.
Great. Well, that brings us to the bottom of the hour, and I believe we've made it through all of the questions. I want to be sensitive to everyone's time. So thank you so much, Dr. Stern, for your time and your expertise today. And Shelley, I'll turn it back over to you for some closing comments.
All right. Thank you. Yes, I would also like to thank Craig for speaking. For those of you attending, once you leave today's webinar, you will receive a survey on the presentation. We would appreciate it if you would complete that and provide your feedback. And just a reminder that a link to the recording as well as the slide presentation will be sent later this afternoon. We hope you can join us at our next webinar, which will be June 26th and is titled Perspective on the Prescription Pipeline. For more information or to register, visit www.pbmi.com, click on Events and then Webinars.